Table of contents. Langston Hughes was a defining figure of the 1920s Harlem Renaissance as an influential poet, playwright, novelist, short story writer, essayist, political commentator and social activist. Known as a poet of the people, his work focused on the everyday lives of the Black working class, earning him renown as one of America's most notable poets. Early life. Hughes was born February 1, 1902, although some evidence shows it may have been 1901, in Joplin, Missouri, to James and Caroline Hughes. When he was a young boy, his parents divorced, and, after his father moved to Mexico, and his mother, whose maiden name was Langston, sought work elsewhere, he was raised by his grandmother, Mary Langston, in Lawrence, Kansas. Mary Langston died when Hughes was around 12 years old, and he relocated to Illinois to live with his mother and stepfather. The family eventually landed in Cleveland. 1/4. According to the first volume of his 1940 autobiography, The Big C, which chronicled his life until the age of 28, Hughes said he often used reading to combat loneliness while growing up. I began to believe in nothing but books and a wonderful world in books where if people suffered, they suffered in beautiful language, not in monosyllables, as we did in Kansas, he wrote. In his Ohio high school, he started writing poetry, focusing on what he called low-down folks and the Black American experience. He would later write that he was influenced at a young age by Carl Sandburg, Walt Whitman and Paul Laurence Dunbar. Upon graduating in 1920, he traveled to Mexico to live with his father for a year. It was during this period that, still a teenager, he wrote The Negro Speaks of Rivers, a free verse poem that ran in the NAACP's The Crisis magazine and garnered him acclaim. It read, in part, "I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Traveling the world." Hughes returned from Mexico and spent 1 year studying at Columbia University in New York City. He didn't love the experience, citing racism, but he became immersed in the burgeoning Harlem cultural and intellectual scene, a period now known as the Harlem Renaissance. Hughes worked several jobs over the next several years, including cook, elevator operator and laundry hand. He was employed as a steward on a ship, traveling to Africa and Europe, and lived in Paris, mingling with the expat artist community there, before returning to America and settling down in Washington, D.C. It was in the nation's capital that, while working as a busboy, he slipped his poetry to the noted poet Vachel Lindsay, cited as the father of modern singing poetry, who helped connect Hughes to the literary world. Hughes' first book of poetry, The Weary Blues, was published in 1926, and he received a scholarship to and, in 1929, graduated from Pennsylvania's Lincoln University. He soon published Not Without Laughter, his first novel, which was awarded the Harmon Gold Medal for Literature. Watch Black History documentaries on History Vault. Jazz Poetry. Harlem Renaissance. 2/4. Called the Poet Laureate of Harlem, he is credited as the father of jazz poetry, a literary genre influenced by or sounding like jazz, with rhythms and phrases inspired by the music. But jazz to me is one of the inherent expressions of Negro life in America, the eternal tom-tom beating in the Negro soul, tom-tom of revolt against weariness in a white world, a world of subway trains, and work, 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 the tom-tom of joy and laughter, and pain swallowed in a smile, he wrote in the 1926 essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. Writing for a general audience, his subject matter continued to focus on ordinary Black Americans. Hughes wrote that his 1927 work, Fine Clothes to the Jew, was about workers, roustabouts, and singers, and job hunters on Lenox Avenue in New York, or 7th Street in Washington or South State in Chicago. People up today and down tomorrow, working this week and fired the next, beaten and baffled, but determined not to be wholly beaten, buying furniture on the installment plan, filling the house with rumors to help pay the rent, hoping to get a new suit for Easter and pawning that suit before the 4th of July. He also did not shy from writing about his experiences and observations. We younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame, he wrote in The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful. And ugly too. Later work. Ever the traveler, Hughes spent time in the South, chronicling racial injustices, and also the Soviet Union in the 1930s, showing an interest in communism. He was called to testify before Congress during the McCarthy hearings in 1953. In 1930, Hughes wrote Mulebone with Zora Neale Hurston, his first play, which would be the first of many. Mulatto, A Tragedy of the Deep South, about race issues, was Broadway's longest-running play written by a black author until Lorraine Hansberry's 1958 play, A Raisin in the Sun. Hansberry based the name of her play on Hughes' 1951 poem, Harlem, in which he writes, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up? Like a raisin in the sun?" 3/4. Hughes wrote the lyrics for Street Scene, a 1947 Broadway musical, and set up residence in a Harlem brownstone on East 127th Street. He co-founded the New York Suitcase Theater, as well as theater troupes in Los Angeles and Chicago. He attempted screenwriting in Hollywood, but found racism blocked his efforts. He worked as a newspaper war correspondent in 1937 for the Baltimore Afro-American, writing about Black American soldiers fighting for the International Brigades during the Spanish Civil War. He also wrote a column from 1942 to 1962 for the Chicago Defender, a black newspaper, focusing on Jim Crow laws and segregation, World War II and the treatment of black people in America. The column often featured a fictitious Jesse B. Semple, known as Simple. In the 1950s and 60s, Hughes wrote a first book series of children's books, patriotic stories about black culture and achievements, including the first book of Negroes, 1952, the first book of jazz, 1955, and the book of Negro folklore, 1958. Among the stories in the 1958 volume is Thank You, Mom, in which a young teenage boy learns a lesson about trust and respect when an older woman he tries to rob ends up taking him home and giving him a meal. Legacy. Hughes died in New York from complications during surgery to treat prostate cancer on May 22, 1967, at the age of 65. His ashes are interred in Harlem's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. His Harlem home was named a New York landmark in 1981, and a National Register of Places a year later. I, too, am America, a quote from his 1926 poem, I, too, is engraved on the wall of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C.